Chapter 1. Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. We meet Peggy Hopkins Joyce at the absolute zenith of her power in 1925 New York, where she reigns as America's most notorious professional bride. Born Marguerite Upton in humble Virginia circumstances in 1893, she has transformed herself into a living legend whose very presence can empty bank accounts and destroy reputations. This chapter establishes the opulent world she has created through 6 strategic marriages, showcasing her Park Avenue penthouse filled with jewels worth millions and admirers willing to bankrupt themselves for a single dance. The narrative explores the paradox of her existence. She possesses everything money can buy, yet remains perpetually hungry for something undefined. Through vivid descriptions of champagne-soaked parties and diamond-encrusted evenings, we see how Peggy has weaponized her beauty into the ultimate business model. However, beneath the silk gowns and emerald necklaces lurks an unsettling question that will define her journey. In a life where every relationship is a transaction and every emotion has a price tag, what happens when the currency begins to devalue? The chapter ends with Peggy examining her reflection, sensing for the first time that her empire might be built on foundations more fragile than she ever imagined. March 15th, 1925. Sunday. Park Avenue Penthouse, New York City. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Park Avenue penthouse caught the diamonds scattered across the Italian marble coffee table, throwing prismatic rainbows against the silk-papered walls. Peggy Hopkins Joyce moved through her domain like a queen surveying her treasury, each step calculated to catch the light just so, each gesture designed to remind the world that she was not merely a woman, but an institution of desire and destruction. At 32, Peggy had perfected the alchemy of transforming beauty into wealth. 6 marriages lay in her wake like stepping stones across a river of masculine foolishness, each one more profitable than the last. The penthouse itself was testament to her success. 18 rooms of imported French furniture, Persian rugs that had once graced the floors of Maharajas, and a jewelry collection that Lloyd's of London had insured for more money than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. She paused before an oil painting of herself commissioned by her 4th husband, a railroad tycoon who had lasted exactly 8 months before she grew bored with his conservative approach to gift-giving. In the portrait, she wore the famous Romanov emeralds, a necklace that had belonged to Russian royalty before the revolution scattered such treasures to the 4 winds. Peggy had acquired them not through inheritance or theft, but through the simple expedient of making a lonely millionaire believe that emeralds were the key to her heart. The telephone rang, its silver tone cutting through the Sunday morning silence. Peggy glanced at the ornate French clock on the mantelpiece, 10:30. Too early for social calls, too late for emergencies. She lifted the receiver with practiced grace, her voice carrying just the right note of sleepy sensuality. Peggy Hopkins Joyce, she purred, though she knew perfectly well who was calling. My darling Peggy, came the breathless voice of Harold Vanderson, heir to a shipping fortune and her current most devoted admirer. I simply cannot wait until this evening. Might I call upon you now? I have something extraordinary to show you. Peggy smiled, an expression that had launched 1,000 lawsuits and twice as many broken hearts. Harold was 24, handsome in the bland way of inherited wealth, and so desperately in love that he trembled when she entered a room. His trust fund was substantial, his family connections impeccable, and his capacity for financial ruin apparently limitless. Harold, darling, she said, settling into a chair that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, you know I never receive gentlemen before noon on Sundays. It wouldn't be proper. She let the word proper hang in the air like expensive perfume, knowing that the suggestion of propriety from Peggy Hopkins Joyce was deliciously absurd. But Peggy, I've purchased something that I simply must. This evening, Harold. Patience is a virtue that makes all pleasures sweeter. She replaced the receiver before he could protest further, already calculating what extraordinary purchase had driven him to such desperation. The truth was that Peggy had grown weary of Harold's predictable devotion. He lacked the dangerous edge that had made her previous conquests interesting. There was no challenge in bankrupting a man who threw money at her feet like rose petals. She preferred her millionaires with a bit more fight in them, men who believed they could tame her, who convinced themselves that their love would be different from all the others. She walked to her dressing room, a temple to vanity that contained more gowns than some department stores. Her maid, a discreet French woman named Celeste, was already preparing her afternoon ensemble, a Worth creation in midnight blue that would perfectly complement the sapphire parure she planned to wear to the opera that evening. "Madame looks thoughtful this morning," Celeste observed, her English carefully modulated to hide her Marseille accent. "I was thinking about legacy, Celeste," Peggy replied, studying her reflection in the three-way mirror. Even in her silk negligee, without makeup or jewelry, she was breathtaking. But for the first time in years, she found herself looking for flaws, searching for signs that time might be gaining ground on her carefully maintained perfection. "What sort of legacy does a woman like me leave behind?" she continued, more to herself than to her maid. "The old families have their names carved in marble, their foundations in hospitals. What do I have?" Celeste, who addressed some of the most famous women in Europe, chose her words carefully. "Madame has made herself unforgettable. That is its own kind of immortality." Unforgettable. Yes, that was true. Peggy Hopkins Joyce was a name that would be whispered in drawing rooms and shouted in headlines long after she was gone. But as she gazed at her reflection, a troubling question began to form in the back of her mind. When the beauty faded and the headlines stopped, when the last millionaire had been conquered and the final divorce settlement collected, what would remain of the girl from Virginia who had once dreamed? Of something more than mere survival? The question followed her as she moved through her morning routine, as she selected jewels and approved menus, and planned the evening's campaign against Harold's increasingly vulnerable fortune. It whispered to her, from the depths of emerald earrings and diamond bracelets, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her own. In a world where everything has a price, what happens when you discover that you've sold the one thing that was truly priceless? But Peggy Hopkins Joyce had not built an empire by dwelling on uncomfortable questions. She had built it by being magnificent, irresistible, and utterly without mercy. As the afternoon sun painted golden rectangles across her Persian rugs, she prepared to do what she did best: make another millionaire fall desperately, ruinously, profitably in love. The game was far from over. But for the first time, Peggy found herself wondering what victory would actually look like, and whether she would recognize it when it finally arrived. Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. This chapter traces Peggy's calculated transformation from Marguerite Upton, a poor Virginia girl, into the legendary Peggy Hopkins Joyce through her first 3 marriages. We witness her methodical study of wealthy society, learning to speak, dress, and manipulate with surgical precision. Her first husband, Everett Hopkins, provides her initial education in luxury and the brutal reality that wealthy men view beautiful wives as possessions. The second marriage to Stanley Joyce gives her the name she will make famous, and teaches her that divorce can be more profitable than marriage itself. By her third union with Swedish Count Myrner, she has perfected her system: marry quickly, extract maximum value through gifts and settlements, then move on to the next conquest. However, the chapter reveals the psychological toll of treating every human connection as a business transaction. Peggy begins experiencing insomnia, an inability to distinguish between genuine emotion and performance, and a growing sense that she is losing herself in the character she has created. The chapter builds tension as she realizes that her reputation as a professional bride is both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. It ends with a pivotal moment where she receives a threatening letter from a former husband's family, forcing her to confront the reality that her past conquests may not remain buried forever. September 3rd, 1910. Thursday. Richmond, Virginia. The girl who would become Peggy Hopkins Joyce stood before the cracked mirror in her family's modest boarding house room, practicing expressions she had studied in stolen copies of Harper's Bazaar. At 17, Marguerite Upton possessed the kind of beauty that made grown men forget their own names, but beauty without education was merely decoration. She had spent months memorizing the mannerisms of wealthy women, the way they held their teacups, the musical quality of their laughter, the subtle art of making men feel both powerful and desperate. Her first target was Everett Hopkins, a businessman 20 years her senior who had noticed her at a church social. He was not particularly wealthy by New York standards, but his modest fortune represented escape from the suffocating poverty that had defined her childhood. The courtship was brief and strategic, 6 weeks of carefully calibrated charm culminating in a wedding that cost more than her family had earned in 5 years. The marriage taught Peggy her first crucial lesson. Wealthy men did not want wives. They wanted beautiful possessions that could speak and smile on command. Everett's love came with invisible chains, servants who reported her movements, opened mail, and social restrictions disguised as protection. The townhouse in Washington, D.C., that had seemed like paradise quickly revealed itself as an elegant prison. But Peggy was nothing if not adaptable. She used her confinement to study, transforming herself with the dedication of a scholar. French lessons eliminated her Virginia accent. Etiquette coaches taught her which fork to use for oysters and how to discuss opera without revealing she had never attended one. She memorized the genealogies of important families, learned to identify quality in everything from wine to jewelry to men. The divorce from Everett was her graduate course in the business of marriage. She discovered that wealthy men feared scandal more than financial loss, that the threat of public embarrassment could be leveraged into generous settlements. When she walked away with enough money to live independently for several years, and a collection of jewelry that would serve as both nest egg and calling card, Peggy understood that she had found her true calling. Stanley Joyce was different, younger, more handsome, and significantly wealthier. Their courtship was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as romance. Peggy had learned to read men like financial statements, identifying their weaknesses and calculating exactly how much pressure to apply. Stanley was lonely, insecure about his inherited wealth, and desperately eager to prove his sophistication by winning the most beautiful woman in Washington. Their wedding made headlines in 3 cities. The reception featured champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month, and Peggy wore diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. For 8 months, she played the role of devoted wife while systematically cataloging Stanley's assets and identifying the most efficient methods of extraction. The divorce settlement included cash, property, and jewelry worth approximately $200,000, a fortune that would allow her to maintain her lifestyle while hunting for her next conquest. More importantly, she kept Stanley's name. Peggy Joyce sounded more sophisticated than Peggy Upton, more memorable, more like the kind of woman who belonged in newspaper society columns. By the time she married Swedish Count Murner in 1913, Peggy had perfected her system. The Count provided something money could not buy, a title that opened doors even wealth could not unlock. As Countess Murner, she gained access to European society, learned to navigate the subtle hierarchies of old-world aristocracy, and added continental sophistication to her arsenal of weapons. But the psychological toll was becoming evident. Peggy found herself unable to sleep without laudanum, her mind racing with calculations and strategies even in the darkest hours of the night. She had trained herself so thoroughly to perform that genuine emotions felt foreign and dangerous. Love, affection, even simple human warmth had become tools to be deployed rather than feelings to be experienced. Standing in her hotel suite in Paris after the Count's divorce was finalized, Peggy examined her reflection in a mirror that had witnessed 1,000 transformations. The girl from Virginia was gone, replaced by a woman who could speak 4 languages, navigate the most exclusive social circles in the world, and reduce grown men to trembling supplicants with a single smile. Yet something essential had been lost in the transformation. She tried to remember the last time she had laughed without calculating its effect, the last time she had touched someone without considering what she might gain from the contact. The memories felt like artifacts from another person's life. The letter arrived on expensive stationery, bearing the Hopkins family crest. Everett's brother, a prominent attorney, had been investigating Peggy's subsequent marriages and was threatening to expose what he called a pattern of predatory behavior designed to defraud vulnerable men. The language was careful, legal, but the threat was clear. Her past was not as buried as she had believed. Peggy read the letter twice, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. She had always known this moment might come, when her success would generate enough resentment to inspire retaliation. The question was not whether she could survive the scandal, but whether she could turn it to her advantage. She walked to her escritoire and began composing her response, her pen moving with the same calculated precision that had guided every decision since she left Virginia. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. But as she wrote, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a troubling question. In becoming the perfect predator, had she forgotten how to be human? The game was becoming more dangerous, but Peggy Hopkins Joyce had never been one to back down from a challenge. She sealed the letter with wax that bore her new coat of arms, purchased, like everything else in her life, but no less impressive for its recent acquisition. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new conquests, and new opportunities to prove that a girl from Virginia could take on the world and win. But tonight, alone in her silk-draped bedroom, she would lie awake calculating odds and wondering what victory would cost her in the end. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. The year 1929 brings Peggy's world crashing down in ways she never anticipated. At the height of the jazz age, she has become America's most notorious celebrity, famous for her marriages, divorces, and extravagant lifestyle. However, the stock market crash devastates many of her former husbands and dries up the pool of available millionaires. More catastrophically, her 5th husband, James Cromwell, a Pittsburgh Steel heir, commits suicide after their divorce, leaving a note that explicitly blames Peggy for his financial and emotional ruin. The scandal transforms her from a glamorous figure into a public pariah overnight. The press, once her ally, turns vicious, painting her as a predatory black widow who destroys men for sport. Federal investigators begin examining her divorce settlements for signs of fraud or undue influence. Society doors that had always been open suddenly slam shut, and former friends abandon her to protect their own reputations. The chapter climaxes with Peggy barricaded in her penthouse as angry crowds gather outside, demanding justice for Cromwell's death. She realizes that her carefully constructed empire is built on public perception, and that perception can shift with devastating speed. The chapter ends with her receiving an ultimatum from her lawyers: accept a greatly reduced settlement from Cromwell's estate and disappear from public life, or face criminal charges that could destroy her forever. October 29, 1929. Tuesday. Park Avenue Penthouse, New York City. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the penthouse as Peggy hurled a baccarat crystal tumbler against the Italian marble fireplace. The morning newspapers lay scattered across the Persian rug like fallen leaves, each headline more devastating than the last. Steel heir dies by his own hand. Suicide note blames notorious ex-wife. The deadly charm of Peggy Hopkins Joyce. James Cromwell had jumped from the roof of his Pittsburgh mansion at dawn, leaving behind a 3-page letter that read like an indictment. The newspapers had printed excerpts with gleeful malice. She took not just my money, but my soul. She made me believe I was the only one, that our love was different from all her other transactions. When I discovered the truth, that I was merely another entry in her ledger, the shame became unbearable. Peggy stood at her window, watching the crowd that had gathered on the street below. They held signs with her photograph crossed out in red, chanting slogans that transformed her name into a curse. The police barriers looked fragile against their rage. For the first time in her adult life, Peggy Hopkins Joyce was afraid. The telephone had been ringing incessantly since 5 a.m, reporters demanding statements, former friends calling to distance themselves, attorneys warning of lawsuits and investigations. She had instructed Celeste to disconnect the line, but the silence felt more ominous than the cacophony. The truth about James Cromwell was more complex than the newspapers suggested, but complexity did not sell papers. He had been fragile when she married him, a sensitive man crushed by the expectations of inherited wealth and industrial responsibility. She had not destroyed him so much as failed to save him, but the distinction was lost in the hurricane of public outrage. Their marriage had lasted 14 months, longer than most of her unions, because James had been different. He wrote poetry, collected rare books, and spoke to her about subjects beyond jewelry and social standing. For brief moments, Peggy had almost forgotten that their relationship was a transaction. Almost. The divorce had been particularly brutal because James had fought it, clinging to the illusion that their marriage could be salvaged through love and compromise. Peggy had been forced to be crueler than usual, to strip away his romantic delusions with surgical precision. She had told him things designed to wound, truths about her other lovers, and her calculations regarding his net worth. She had watched the light die in his eyes and felt nothing but impatience to be done with the proceedings. Now that indifference had returned to haunt her, the press had discovered James's medical records, his history of melancholia, his previous suicide attempt in college. They painted a picture of a vulnerable man preyed upon by a calculating predator, and the public embraced the narrative with righteous fury. Celeste entered the room carrying a silver tray with a single envelope. Her hands shook as she set it down, and Peggy noticed that the woman who had dressed her for 100 triumphs could barely meet her eyes. "From your attorneys, madam," Celeste whispered. "They say it is urgent." The letter was brief and devastating. Federal investigators were examining all of Peggy's divorce settlements for evidence of fraud, extortion, or undue influence. The Cromwell family was demanding the return of all gifts and settlements, claiming they had been obtained through emotional manipulation of a mentally unstable man. Most ominously, the Attorney General's office was considering criminal charges related to what they termed a pattern of predatory behavior designed to exploit vulnerable individuals. Her lawyers recommended immediate damage control, accept a drastically reduced settlement from the Cromwell estate, issue a public apology expressing remorse for James's death, and withdraw from public life indefinitely. The alternative was a criminal trial that would destroy her reputation permanently and likely result in prison time. Peggy crumpled the letter and walked to her dressing room, staring at the hundreds of gowns that had been her armor in countless battles. Each dress represented a conquest, a successful negotiation of desire and wealth. Now they looked like costumes from a play that had closed to terrible reviews. She pulled out a photograph from her jewelry box, James at their wedding, looking impossibly young and hopeful. He had been genuinely happy that day, believing that he had won the greatest prize in America. The photograph trembled in her hands as she realized that she could not remember being happy herself, not once, in all the years since she had left Virginia. The crowd outside was growing larger, their chants more violent. Someone threw a rock that shattered one of the lower windows, and Peggy heard the sound of police sirens approaching. The woman who had conquered Millionaires was now under siege in her own home, protected only by glass and marble that suddenly seemed as fragile as tissue paper. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Celeste announced that Mr. Harrison, her lead attorney, had arrived through the service entrance to avoid the crowd. He entered the room looking haggard, his usual composure shattered by the magnitude of the crisis. "Peggy, you have to decide now," he said without preamble. The district attorney is convening a grand jury tomorrow. If you don't accept the family's terms and disappear, they will indict you. The evidence may be circumstantial, but the public wants blood, and you've become the perfect sacrifice." She looked at him, this man who had negotiated her victories and managed her scandals, and saw only calculation in his eyes. He was already distancing himself, already planning how to survive the collapse of her empire. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely audible. 50,000, and a signed confession admitting that you manipulated James's emotional state for financial gain. The amount was insulting, less than she had spent on jewelry in a single shopping expedition. But the confession was the real price. It would brand her forever as the monster the newspapers had painted, the woman who drove men to death for money. Outside, the crowd was singing now, a funeral dirge with her name as the refrain. The sound drifted through the broken window, mixing with the distant wail of sirens and the whispered prayers of her terrified staff. Peggy Hopkins Joyce, who had never surrendered in her life, realized that she was facing her first absolute defeat. The game she had played so masterfully had turned against her, and the rules she had learned to manipulate were being rewritten by forces beyond her control. She reached for her fountain pen, the same one she had used to sign 6 marriage certificates and 6 divorce decrees. Her hand hesitated over the confession, the words blurring through tears she had not shed in 20 years. For the first time since leaving Virginia, Peggy Hopkins Joyce was completely, utterly powerless. And the most terrifying part was not the loss of wealth or status, but the realization that she had no idea who she was without them. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Following her public disgrace, Peggy enters a decade-long spiral of decline that strips away everything she once held dear. The 1930s bring the Great Depression, making her previous extravagance seem obscene to a suffering nation. She retreats to a modest apartment, forced to sell her legendary jewelry collection piece by piece to maintain even a shadow of her former lifestyle. Her attempts at reinvention, writing memoirs, appearing in films, launching business ventures, all fail spectacularly as the public refuses to forgive or forget. The psychological toll becomes evident through her increasing dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs, her paranoid belief that former lovers are conspiring against her, and her compulsive mirror-checking as her famous beauty begins to fade. A devastating scene shows her at a society party where she is openly snubbed by women who once competed for her attention. The chapter explores her growing isolation as friends abandon her, servants leave for more stable employment, and even her loyal maid Celeste finally departs. The twist comes when Peggy discovers that several of her ex-husbands have been meeting secretly, pooling resources to ensure she never regains her former power. The chapter ends with her receiving news that her last remaining asset, a small property in Virginia, has been seized for unpaid taxes, leaving her truly destitute for the first time since her youth. November 15th, 1935. Friday. A modest apartment on East 67th Street, New York City. The apartment smelled of gin and desperation, a combination that had become as familiar to Peggy as her own reflection. She sat at a small table covered with pawnshop receipts and newspaper clippings, methodically sorting through the debris of her empire. The Romanov emeralds had gone last month, sold to a collector who recognized their historical value, but not their former owner. The Star of India sapphires had followed 2 weeks later, pawned for a fraction of their worth to pay rent and keep the electricity connected. At 42, Peggy Hopkins Joyce was learning the mathematics of poverty with the same precision she had once applied to calculating her lover's net worth. Every piece of jewelry represented weeks of survival. Every gown sold meant another month in the apartment that had become her refuge and her prison. The morning mail brought fresh humiliation, a rejection letter from a publisher who had seemed interested in her memoirs. While Mrs. Joyce's story is undoubtedly colorful, the editor wrote, The current market shows little appetite for tales of jazz age excess. Readers prefer stories of triumph over adversity, not accounts of self-inflicted downfall. She'd poured herself a drink, though it was barely noon, and studied her reflection in the window glass. The face that had launched 1,000 headlines was still beautiful, but it was a beauty under siege. Fine lines radiated from her eyes like cracks in porcelain, and no amount of makeup could disguise the hollow look of someone who had stopped sleeping properly years ago. The telephone rang, and for a moment, Peggy's heart leaped with the old expectation of opportunity. But it was only her landlord, politely inquiring about next month's rent. She assured him the payment would be forthcoming, though her bank account suggested otherwise. The cruel irony of her situation was not lost on her. The woman who had bankrupted Millionaires was now counting pennies, reduced to shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons like any ordinary housewife. She had fallen further than most people ever climbed, and the distance between her current reality and her former glory felt infinite. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find a young reporter from a scandal magazine, eager and predatory in the way that reminded her of herself at 20. "Mrs. Joyce," he began, his camera already flashing, "would you care to comment on the rumors that your former husbands have formed what some are calling a Peggy Protection Society?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected something of the sort: the coordinated legal challenges, the simultaneous credit denials, the way opportunities seemed to evaporate just as they appeared within reach. But to hear it confirmed, to know that the men she had conquered were now conspiring to ensure her permanent defeat, was devastating. "I have no comment," she managed, closing the door before the reporter could ask follow-up questions. But the damage was done. She spent the rest of the afternoon researching the story, using her few remaining contacts to piece together the truth. 5 of her ex-husbands, led by Stanley Joyce, had indeed been meeting regularly since her public disgrace. They had pooled resources to hire investigators, lawyers, and public relations specialists with a single goal: ensuring that Peggy Hopkins Joyce never again gained the power to destroy wealthy men. They had been remarkably thorough. Every business venture she attempted was quietly sabotaged through whisper campaigns and financial pressure. Publishers who showed interest in her story suddenly developed cold feet after mysterious phone calls from prominent citizens. Even her attempts to find work as a sales clerk or secretary were thwarted by background checks that painted her as untrustworthy. The realization that she was facing an organized conspiracy rather than simple bad luck was oddly liberating. At least it confirmed that she was still considered dangerous enough to require active suppression. But it also meant that her situation was hopeless. She was fighting not just poverty and public opinion, but a coordinated campaign by some of the most powerful men in America. As evening fell, Peggy opened the final letter in her mail pile. It was from the tax assessor's office in Virginia, informing her that her last remaining asset, a small property she had inherited from her mother, was being seized for unpaid taxes. The amount owed was trivial by her former standards, but it might as well have been $1 million given her current circumstances. She walked to the window and looked out at the city that had once worshipped her. The lights twinkled like the diamonds she had worn to 1,000 parties, beautiful but cold and ultimately meaningless. Somewhere out there, in penthouses and townhouses, her former lovers were sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had finally tamed the woman who had once made them grovel. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of absolute defeat. Peggy Hopkins Joyce, who had never surrendered in her life, finally understood that some battles could not be won through charm or calculation or sheer force of will. Sometimes the house always won, and the only choice left was how gracefully to accept the inevitable. She poured herself another drink and began planning her next move, though for the first time in her adult life, she had no idea what that might be. The game she had mastered was over, and she had never learned to play by any other rules. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the ticking of a cheap clock and the distant sound of traffic, carrying other people to destinations that no longer included her. Peggy Hopkins Joyce was finally, completely, utterly alone with the consequences of a lifetime spent treating human hearts like commodities to be bought and sold. And the most terrifying realization was that she was not sure she remembered how to be anything else. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. The final chapter finds Peggy in her last years, living quietly in a small apartment, her legendary beauty ravaged by time and her infamous lifestyle reduced to memories and newspaper clippings. Now in her 60s, she survives on a modest income from occasional interviews, where journalists treat her as a curiosity from a bygone era. The chapter explores her growing self-awareness as she finally confronts the true cost of her choices, not just the financial ruin or social ostracism, but the profound spiritual emptiness that comes from a life lived entirely in performance. A young woman writes to her seeking advice on marrying well, prompting Peggy to reflect on what wisdom she might offer. In her response, she reveals a hard-won understanding that wealth without genuine human connection is merely elaborate poverty. The chapter culminates with her death in 1957, alone in her apartment, her body undiscovered for days. Her obituaries are longer than expected, revealing that she had become a symbol of her era's excess and moral ambiguity. The final irony is that the woman who had accumulated millions through strategic marriages died with an estate worth less than $50,000. Her true legacy is not the wealth she gathered, but the cautionary tale she became, a reminder that in the pursuit of everything, it is possible to lose the only thing that truly matters, oneself. June 12, 1957. Wednesday. A small apartment on East 67th Street, New York City. The morning light filtered through threadbare curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the stale air. Peggy Hopkins Joyce sat in a chair that had once been expensive, but now bore the shabby dignity of age, much like its occupant. At 64, she was still recognizably the woman whose photograph had once graced the front pages of newspapers around the world, but time had edited her features with ruthless precision, leaving behind a face that spoke of beauty remembered rather than beauty present. The apartment was smaller than her former dressing room, furnished with pieces that were respectable, but unremarkable. The only hint of her former grandeur was a single photograph on the mantelpiece, herself at 25, dripping in diamonds at a Paris nightclub, surrounded by admirers whose names she could no longer recall. She looked at that image sometimes and felt as if she were viewing a stranger, someone she had once known intimately but could no longer quite understand. The morning mail brought the usual assortment of bills and advertisements, but tucked among them was a letter that made her pause. The return address was from a young woman in California, and the careful handwriting suggested both education and desperation, a combination Peggy recognized from her own distant past. She opened the letter with fingers that trembled slightly, a tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the recognition of her younger self in the carefully chosen words. Dear Mrs. Joyce, I have read about your life in magazines and newspapers, and I find myself in a situation that I believe you would understand. I am 22 years old, and a gentleman of considerable wealth has expressed interest in marriage. My family thinks I should accept, but I find myself wondering what the true cost of such a decision might be. You are the only person I can think of who might give me honest advice about the realities of marrying for security rather than love. I hope you will not think me presumptuous for writing. Peggy set the letter down and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had once been her stage. The young woman's question echoed through the decades, carrying her back to that girl from Virginia who had stood before a cracked mirror practicing expressions stolen from fashion magazines. The answer she might have given at 25 would have been very different from the one she felt compelled to give now. She sat at her small writing desk and began to compose her response, choosing each word with the care of someone who had finally learned the weight of language. "My dear child," she wrote, "you ask about the cost of marrying for security, and I find that after 40 years of such calculations, I am finally qualified to give you an honest accounting. The price is not what you might expect, not social ostracism or moral judgment, though those will certainly come. The true cost is the gradual erosion of your ability to distinguish between performance and reality, between the character you play and the person you actually are. I became so skilled at being what men wanted that I forgot how to be what I needed. I collected husbands like some women collect jewelry, but unlike jewelry, husbands are human beings with souls, and when you treat souls as commodities, something essential dies in both the buyer and the seller. If you must marry for security, do so with your eyes open to what you are sacrificing. But if you have any other choice, any talent, any family support, any possibility of independence, I beg you to consider it seriously. The cage may be golden, but it is still a cage, and the key is always in someone else's pocket." She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself, then returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon stretched ahead with the particular emptiness that had become her constant companion. There were no appointments to keep, no admirers to manage, no strategies to plan. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely free, and the freedom felt like falling. As evening approached, Peggy found herself thinking about James Cromwell, the sensitive man whose death had marked the beginning of her downfall. She wondered if he would have forgiven her, if he would have understood that she had been as trapped by her reputation as he had been destroyed by it. The thought brought an unexpected wave of grief, not for the life she had lost, but for the lives she had damaged in her relentless pursuit of security. She prepared for bed with the same careful routine she had maintained for decades, applying creams and setting her hair as if she still had audiences to impress. The habits of vanity died hard, even when vanity itself had become pointless. As she looked in the bathroom mirror, she saw not the legendary beauty who had bankrupted millionaires, but a tired old woman who had spent her entire life running from poverty and had ended up impoverished in ways she had never imagined. The next morning, the building superintendent would find her in her chair by the window, peaceful in death as she had never been in life. The newspapers would run obituaries that were surprisingly lengthy, treating her as a symbol of an era rather than simply a scandalous individual. They would catalog her marriages and settlements, her rise and fall, her transformation from small-town girl to international celebrity to cautionary tale. But what the obituaries could not capture was the final irony of her existence. The woman who had spent her life accumulating wealth had died with an estate worth less than $50,000. The diamonds had been sold, the properties liquidated, the settlements spent. All that remained were memories and newspaper clippings, the paper trail of a life lived entirely in public. In her final moments, as consciousness faded like the last light of evening, Peggy Hopkins Joyce finally understood the answer to the question that had haunted her since childhood. How far could beauty take a girl who had nothing else? The answer was everywhere and nowhere. Beauty could open any door, command any stage, purchase any luxury, but it could not buy the one thing she had never thought to value: the simple peace of being genuinely known and loved for who she truly was, rather than what she could provide. The girl from Virginia had wanted more, and she had gotten it. But in the end, more had turned out to be less than she had ever imagined, and the victory she had spent a lifetime pursuing tasted remarkably like defeat. The greatest tragedy was not that she had failed, but that she had succeeded so completely at becoming exactly what she had set out to be, and discovered too late that her ambitions had been far too small.